The whisper that broke the silence of Emma Collins's life wasn't the wind whistling through the cottonwoods, nor the gentle stirrings of her sleeping son. It was a sound of death, faint and ragged, coming from the shadows of her own barn. She was a widow, a settler, a woman holding the ragged edges of her world together with grit and prayer in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Arizona Territory. She thought the greatest dangers were the drought, the loneliness, the ghosts of a past she couldn't outrun. She was wrong. The man she found bleeding out on her hay bales would prove to be a danger of a different kind, and by the time the sun bled across the horizon, his people, the feared Chiricahua Apache, would have her farm, her son, and her very life surrounded. The dust of the Arizona Territory had a taste. Emma Collins knew it better than she knew the taste of baker's bread or city water. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated her tongue, settled in the lines of her face, and clung to the hem of her worn calico dress. It was the taste of survival. Her farm, a stubborn patch of green carved out of the ochre landscape, was a monument to a dead man's dream. John Collins had seen a paradise here, nestled in a shallow valley with the Dragoon Mountains standing as silent purple sentinels to the east. He'd spoken of a legacy of sons and daughters growing tall under the endless sky. He'd dug the well with his own blistered hands and raised the bones of the house and barn beam by beam. Then, a fever swift and merciless as a summer flash flood had taken him, leaving Emma with their 5-year-old son Samuel and the crushing weight of that dream. That was 2 years ago. Now life was a rhythm of chores dictated by the sun, tending the small vegetable patch, milking their lone cow, mending Samuel's worn-out trousers, and sitting on the porch in the evenings with a shotgun across her lap, watching the shadows grow long and menacing. The loneliness was a physical presence, a cold spot in the bed next to her, an empty chair at the small dinner table. Tonight the wind was restless. It moaned around the corners of the small cabin, making the lantern light flicker and dance. Samuel was asleep in his small cot, his chest rising and falling in the innocent peace that was Emma's only true solace. She had just finished cleaning the supper dishes when she heard it. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the hoot of an owl. It was a low, guttural sound, barely audible over the wind, a sound of profound pain. Her heart leaped into her throat. Her first thought was of a cougar, or perhaps a wolf, caught in one of the old traps John had set along the creek bed. She grabbed the shotgun from its hooks by the door, her knuckles white. Checking the lock on the cabin door, she peered through the single glass pane. The moon was a sliver, casting more shadow than light. The barn, a dark, hulking shape, 100 feet away, was where the sound had come from. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside to protect her son. But the sound came again, weaker this time, a ragged exhalation that sounded disturbingly human. Was it a traveler, a prospector who'd lost his way? Her nearest neighbor, the gruff but decent Mr. Abernathy, was a good 5 miles east. No one had reason to be out here after dark. No one decent anyway. The stories of outlaws and bandits were whispered with fear in the nearby town of Providence. Men like Silas Croft's gang, who were rumored to have been the ones who raided the Miller homestead last spring. Taking a deep breath, Emma cocked the shotgun. The click was unnervingly loud in the quiet. She slipped out the door, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Each step toward the barn was a battle between her compassion and her terror. The large barn door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. She pushed it open. The familiar smell of hay and animal musk washed over her, thick and cloying. The interior was a pit of blackness, disturbed only by the thin shafts of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. "Hello," she called out, her voice a fragile tremor. "Is someone in there?" Silence. Then a rustle from the hayloft. She raised the shotgun, pointing it toward the sound. Her hands were slick with sweat. "I'm armed," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Show yourself." A long, agonizing moment passed. Then a figure shifted in the shadows, slumping down from the loft to land with a heavy, muffled thud on the hay-strewn floor below. The moonlight caught him. Emma's breath hitched, and a cold dread washed over her, colder than any winter night. It was not a prospector. It was not a traveler. It was an Apache warrior. He was bare-chested, his dark skin gleaming with sweat and something darker. A crude buckskin breechcloth was all he wore. His long black hair was matted with blood that trickled from a gash on his temple. But it was the wound in his side that made her stomach clench a deep, ragged tear, just below his ribs, pulsing with a slow, steady seep of blood that stained the clean hay, a terrifying black. His face, lean and sharply angled, was contorted in a mask of pain, but his eyes, dark and fierce, even in his agony, were fixed on her. In one hand, he still clutched a knife. Every story she had ever heard, every prejudice whispered in town, every fearful glance at the distant mountains coalesced into a single, paralyzing thought demon. The savage enemy who raided settlements, the reason she kept a shotgun by her door. This was the monster from the fireside tales dying in her barn. He tried to push himself up a snarl, twisting his lips, but a wave of agony racked his body, and he collapsed back, his head lolling to the side. His knife fell from his weakened grasp. Emma stood frozen, the heavy shotgun feeling like a lead weight in her arms. Her mind was a whirlwind. She could shoot him. Right now, end the threat. No one would ever know. It would be her word against a dead Apache. It was the sensible thing to do, the thing John or any other settler would have done without a second thought. But then she looked at his face again. Beneath the grime and the blood he was young. Younger than she was, perhaps. And the look in his eyes wasn't just ferocity. It was desperation. He was a dying man, miles from his people, bleeding out on the floor of her barn. He was no longer a warrior. He was just a man drowning in his own blood. Her compassion, a trait she thought this harsh land had all but extinguished, stirred within her. She saw not the savage of legend, but a son, a brother, perhaps a husband. She thought of Samuel safe in his bed. She thought of the sanctity of life, a value her preacher father had instilled in her back in Ohio. Slowly, cautiously, she lowered the barrel of the shotgun. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like a surrender to a part of herself she refused to let die. She was going to help him, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this single act of mercy might very well be the end of her. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Rain began to fall in heavy sporadic drops, quickly escalating into a torrential downpour that hammered against the barn's tin roof like a frantic drumbeat. The wind howled, turning its earlier mournful moan into a furious shriek. It was as if the sky itself was raging against her decision. Inside the barn, the sudden cacophony seemed to rouse the Apache. His eyes fluttered open, locking onto hers again. A low groan escaped his lips. He needed to be moved. He couldn't stay in the damp, drafty barn. The cold would kill him as surely as the wound. I'm not going to hurt you," Emma said, her voice feeling small against the storm's fury. She doubted he understood a word, but the tone might convey something. She laid the shotgun down carefully, well out of his reach, but close enough for her own peace of mind. Kneeling beside him was one of the hardest things she'd ever done. He smelled of sweat-blood pine and wet earth. Up close, She could see the corded muscles in his arms and chest, the intricate patterns of old scars that told stories of a life she couldn't begin to imagine. His breathing was shallow, his skin feverishly hot to the touch. "I have to move you to the house," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "The fire. I have medicine." He watched her with an unnerving intensity, his dark eyes narrowed in suspicion and pain. She pointed toward the house, then to him, then made a motion of walking. He gave no sign of understanding, but when she reached for his arm, he flinched, his body tensing as if to fight. "Easy," she soothed, pulling her hand back. "Easy. I'm trying to help. Help." She mimed drinking water, then pointed to his wound and mimed bandaging it. A flicker of something comprehension, or perhaps just weary resignation, passed through his eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Getting him to the house was a nightmare. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She hooked his arm over her shoulders, her small frame straining under the load. Every step was a Herculean effort. He gasped in pain, with each jostle his hot breath against her neck. The 100-foot dash through the sheeting rain felt like a mile-long trek through a battlefield. They stumbled through the cabin door, soaking wet and shivering, leaving a muddy, bloody trail on her clean, swept floorboards. She managed to get him onto the rag rug in front of the hearth, where the embers of the fire still glowed. He collapsed onto his back, his eyes squeezed shut against the pain. While he drifted in and out of consciousness, Emma flew into action. She stoked the fire until it blazed, casting flickering orange light across his still form. She barred the door, then hurried to fetch her medical supplies, a small wooden box containing carbolic acid clean linen bandages from a torn-up bedsheet, a needle and gut thread. She lit another lantern, placing it close. Now, in the full light, she could see the wound properly. It was worse than she'd thought. A bullet wound, by the looks of it. A clean entry point in his back, but the exit in his side was a ragged, brutal mess. He was burning with fever. Steeling herself, she took a clean cloth and a basin of warm water and began to clean the wound. He awoke with a sharp hiss of breath as she touched the inflamed skin, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Diush shash!" He snarled the words, guttural and harsh. Emma froze, her heart pounding. His eyes were blazing with a delirious fire. "I know it hurts," she said softly, not pulling away. "But it's poisoned. The wound is poisoned. It has to be cleaned, or you will die." She met his gaze, holding it steadily, pouring all her sincerity and desperation into her eyes. "Please," she whispered. "Let me." Slowly, agonizingly, his grip loosened. His hand fell away, and he lay back, his jaw clenched, his body rigid as she resumed her work. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, flushing it with water and a diluted drop of the stinging carbolic acid. He never cried out again, but she could see the tremors that ran through his body, the sweat beading on his forehead. She found the bullet. It was lodged against a rib, flattened and ugly. Probing for it with a pair of sterilized pliers was a grisly, intimate task that made her feel sick to her stomach. He grunted a deep, primal sound of agony, but he remained still. When the lead ball finally came free with a sickening squelch, he went limp, his body surrendering to the relief of unconsciousness. Now came the sewing. Her hands trembled as she threaded the needle. She had stitched up livestock and her own cuts before, but never anything like this. Never on a person, and certainly not on an Apache warrior who, if he lived, might slit her throat for her troubles. She stitched the torn flesh together with small, neat movements, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she was done, she covered the wound with a thick pad of linen and bound his torso tightly. Exhausted, She slumped back on her heels. The storm outside had lessened to a steady drumming rain. The only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of the fire, the rain, and the man's shallow breathing. He looked different now, cleaned of the worst of the blood and grime. His face in repose was handsome in a severe, striking way. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a proud nose. He was just a man. A wounded, vulnerable man. She covered him with a thick wool blanket and sat in the rocking chair, the shotgun once again laid across her lap. She couldn't sleep. She could only watch him, her mind racing. Who was he? Who had shot him? Silas Croft's men, perhaps. They were known to be in the area. And more importantly, what would happen when his people came looking for him, because they would come. The Apache did not abandon their own. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, the first pale grey light of dawn was filtering through the window. The rain had stopped. Her neck was stiff and her muscles ached. She looked toward the hearth. The Apache was awake. He had pushed himself up into a sitting position, his back against the stone of the fireplace. The blanket had fallen away, revealing the fresh white bandage stark against his dark skin. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the cot in the corner. Samuel was awake too. He was sitting up, his blue eyes wide, with a child's unfiltered curiosity, not fear. He was staring at the strange man by his mother's fire. The warrior's expression was unreadable. He simply watched the boy, his fierce gaze softened by an emotion Emma couldn't name. Then Samuel smiled. A small, sleepy, gap-toothed smile. "Hello," the boy said, his voice clear in the quiet room. Before Emma or the warrior could react, a new sound broke the morning stillness. It started as a low, rhythmic beat, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The thud of unshod hooves on wet ground. Dozens of them. Emma's blood ran cold. She scrambled to the window, peering through the glass. Her heart stopped. The mist was lifting from the valley, revealing the scene she had dreaded all night. Her farm was surrounded. On the low ridge to the east, silhouetted against the rising sun, were riders. More in the cottonwoods by the creek, more by the road leading to town. At least 30 of them, maybe more. All mounted, all armed with rifles and lances, their faces grim and impassive. They sat on their horses, perfectly still, watching the small cabin. They had come for their own. The bill for her act of mercy had just arrived. The silence was absolute. The 30 or more Apache warriors sat on their ponies like statues carved from the morning mist, their collective gaze a palpable weight on the small cabin. There were no war cries, no threatening gestures, just a calm, patient, and utterly terrifying encirclement. They were not attacking. They were waiting. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Emma backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs, so hard she felt lightheaded. She looked from the silent army outside to the wounded man by her fire. He had heard them, too. He was trying to get to his feet, a grim determination set on his face. "No, stay down," Emma hissed, rushing to his side. "You'll tear your stitches." He ignored her, pushing her hand away. With a pained grunt, he managed to rise, using the stone mantelpiece for support. He swayed on his feet, his face pale beneath his copper skin, but his eyes were filled with a fierce pride. He would not be found lying helpless on a white woman's floor. A single rider detached from the group on the ridge and began to walk his horse slowly toward the cabin. He was older than the others, his long hair streaked with grey. He carried himself with an air of authority that needed no announcement. A chief. He held a rifle across his lap, but he made no move to raise it. Emma's mind raced. She could grab the shotgun. But what good would 2 barrels do against 30 rifles? It would be suicide, and it would orphan her son. Samuel, bless his innocent heart, was not scared. He had climbed out of his cot and padded over to the window, his small nose pressed against the glass. Mama, look. Horses. Samuel, get away from the window. Now Emma ordered, her voice sharp with fear. The wounded warrior looked down at Samuel, then at Emma. He spoke, his voice raspy but clear. The words were in his own tongue, but the meaning was obvious. They are my people. Do not be afraid. He gestured for her to open the door. To open the door felt like inviting death into her home, but to refuse might provoke the very violence she feared. Her gaze flickered to her son, who was now hiding behind her skirts, finally sensing the danger. She had to protect him. Taking a shuddering breath, she walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she lifted the heavy wooden bar. The wounded man limped behind her, standing tall, despite the agony it must have cost him. He placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, a gesture that was both a reassurance and a warning. She pulled the door open. The morning air was crisp and clean after the rain. The chief had stopped his horse about 20 yards from the porch. His face was a mask of stern, weathered lines, his eyes dark and penetrating. He looked past Emma, his gaze falling upon the man at her side. A flicker of relief crossed his features, so fleeting it was almost imperceptible, quickly replaced by a stony gravity. He spoke, his voice a low rumble that carried easily in the still air. It was a question directed at the wounded man. The man beside Emma answered his voice, weaker but steady. He spoke for several moments, his words punctuated by gestures toward Emma, toward his bandaged side, and toward the inside of the cabin. Emma couldn't understand a word, but she could guess the narrative. She found me. She helped me. She did not kill me. When he finished, the chief was silent for a long time, his eyes moving from his warrior to Emma. He scrutinized her, his gaze stripping away all pretense, looking for the truth of her heart. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the fear in her eyes, and perhaps the faint smudges of blood still under her fingernails. Then, to Emma's shock, another man spoke this time, in accented but clear English. He was younger, riding beside the chief. My father, Chief Esker, asks why you gave aid to an enemy of your people. Emma's throat was dry. She found her voice praying it wouldn't shake. He was a dying man. She said, her voice stronger than she expected. My faith teaches me to show mercy. It had nothing to do with his people or mine. The Chief Esker listened to the translation, his expression unchanging. He spoke again in Apache. He asks if you know who this is, the translator said. Emma shook her head. He is a man who was hurt. That is all I know. The wounded man beside her spoke his own name for the first time, his voice ringing with pride. Talion. The translator added, This is Talion. He is the son of Chief Esker. He is to be our next war chief. He was not in a battle with your soldiers. He was tracking white men outlaws who raided a ranchero camp to the south. The same men, we believe, who have been raiding your people as well. They ambushed him. Silas Croft. The name flashed in Emma's mind. The Miller homestead. It all clicked into place. This wasn't some random act of violence. There was a common enemy. Chief Esker spoke a final lengthy command. The translator turned to Emma, his face grim. Talion is too weak to be moved. We will make camp by the creek. We will not harm you or the boy. You will continue to care for him. Our healers will bring herbs. When he is strong enough to ride, we will leave. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. But there is a condition, the translator continued, his eyes hard. You have shown a strange kindness. We do not trust it. You will be watched. Every move you make. If any harm comes to Talion, if you try to signal the town, if you betray us in any way, this farm will burn, and you and your boy will pay the price. We give you this truce, white woman. Do not make us regret it." With that, Chief Esker turned his horse and rode back to the ridge. The other warriors began to disperse, not leaving but melting back into the landscape, taking up positions in the trees and behind the rocks. They were still there, an army of ghosts, their presence a constant silent threat. Emma let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She was alive. Samuel was safe. But her home was no longer her own. She was a prisoner on her own land, caught between the suspicions of the Apache and the certain condemnation of her own people should they ever find out. She turned and looked at Talion. He was watching her, his expression a complex mixture of gratitude, pain, and something else, a deep, searching curiosity. The siege was over, but the true test had just begun. Their two worlds had collided in her small cabin, and the aftershocks she knew would change everything. The days that followed were lived on the edge of a knife. The Apache camp by the creek was a discreet but constant presence. Smoke from their small, carefully tended fires was a faint haze in the morning air, and at night Emma would sometimes see the dark shapes of sentries moving silently along the ridgeline. They kept their promise, never setting foot on her land, past the creek bed, but their eyes were always on the cabin. Emma Collins's life, once defined by lonely, predictable rhythms, was now a tapestry of tension and strange new routines. An older Apache woman, her face a beautiful roadmap of wrinkles, would come to the edge of the creek each morning, leaving a small leather pouch. Inside were potent-smelling herbs and roots. Through a series of gestures, Talion explained that they were for a poultice to fight infection and a tea to break his fever. Talion healed with a speed that astonished her. The Apache resilience was not a myth. Within a week the fever broke, and he was able to move around the cabin, his limp becoming less pronounced each day. The silence between them, at first thick with suspicion, slowly began to thin. Communication was a clumsy dance of gestures and single words. He would point to the cow. "Wakashi," he'd say. "Cow," she'd reply. She would point to the sky. "Sky." "Yadilil," he would counter. Their vocabularies grew word by word, a fragile bridge being built between them. He watched everything she did with an intense, quiet curiosity. He observed the way she tended her garden, the patience with which she repaired the water pump, the gentle firmness she used with Samuel. He saw not the helpless white woman of Apache lore, but a woman of immense strength and fortitude, wrestling a living from the same harsh land his own people revered. The most profound connection, however, was forged through her son. Samuel, with a child's blissful ignorance of prejudice, adopted Talion as a fascinating new fixture in his life. He would sit by the hearth and watch as Talion sharpened his knife with a whetstone, or sit mesmerized as the warrior's strong fingers deftly wove a small snare from a piece of twine. One afternoon, Talion took a piece of willow and a string from his own bow and fashioned a small, perfect replica for Samuel. He took the boy outside into the watchful eyes of the distant sentries and showed him how to nock a tiny, blunt-tipped arrow. Emma watched from the porch, her heart caught in her throat. Seeing the tall, powerful warrior patiently guiding her small son's hands was a sight so strange and yet so fundamentally right that it brought tears to her eyes. Talion began to contribute in small ways. He saw her struggling to fix a broken fence post, and with a few deft moves showed her how to lash it securely with rawhide, a bond far stronger than her iron nails. He would sit outside in the evenings carving, and the next morning she would find a small, intricate figure of a hawk or a wolf left on the porch railing for Samuel. He was repaying his debt not just with labor, but with pieces of his culture, pieces of himself. One evening, as she sat mending a shirt and he sat cleaning his rifle, a Winchester, she noted the same model as John's. He spoke, using the careful English words she had been teaching him. "Your man?" he asked, gesturing vaguely around the cabin. "He is gone." Emma's hands stilled. She hadn't spoken of John to anyone in 2 years. "My husband," she corrected softly. "His name was John. He died. A fever." Talion was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "I am sorry," he said, the word sounding formal but sincere. He then touched his own chest. "My woman," he said, using her term. "Shiazi, my son. She was killed by the men who shot me." Emma looked up, stunned. "Silas Croft's gang." Talion nodded, his eyes hardening. "They raid. They take what is not theirs. They do not kill for need. They kill for sport. They killed her. They killed our child." The last words were a bare whisper, a confession of a pain so deep it was almost sacred. In that moment, everything shifted. He was no longer just the Apache warrior, the son of a chief. She was no longer just the White Widow. They were two people bound by a shared, cavernous grief. They were survivors haunted by the ghosts of those they had loved and lost to the senseless violence of this land. The truce, once an order imposed by his father, was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a bond forged in the quiet spaces of shared loss and mutual respect. The outside world, however, had not forgotten them. One morning, the sound of a wagon broke the stillness. Emma's heart seized with panic. It was Mr. Abernathy, her neighbor, making his weekly trip toward Providence. He always stopped to check on the widow and her boy. Talion immediately faded back into the shadows of the cabin. "Tell him nothing," he commanded, in a low voice. Emma smoothed her apron, her hands trembling, and went out to the porch. "Morning, Mr. Abernathy," she called out, forcing a smile. The old man tipped his hat, his kindly wrinkled face etched with concern. "Morning, Emma. All's well. Haven't seen much smoke from your chimney these past few days." "All's fine," she lied, her voice tight. "Just been busy. Samuel and I are well." Abernathy's eyes scanned the property lingering on the creek. He squinted. "Funny thing, saw tracks down by the river road yesterday. Unshod ponies. A lot of them. You be careful, you hear. There's talk in town the Chiricahua are restless." "I'm always careful, Mr. Abernathy," she said. He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "All right then. You need anything from town, you send Samuel over with a signal fire. Don't you hesitate." He clucked to his horses, and the wagon rumbled on, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Emma leaned against the porch post, her knees weak with relief. The lie had felt like ash in her mouth. When she went back inside, Talion was standing by the window, watching the wagon disappear. His face was grim. "He is a good man," Emma said quietly. "He is a white man," Talion countered, his voice flat. "If he knew I was here, he would bring the sheriff. The sheriff would bring a posse. They would not ask questions. They would only shoot." He was right, and she knew it. The fragile peace they had built existed in a bubble, a tiny pocket of understanding, in a world that would never tolerate it. The farm was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a secret. And secrets in the unforgiving glare of the Arizona sun had a way of getting people killed. The full moon, the deadline for Talion's recovery, came and went. His wounds had healed into a puckered red scar, a permanent reminder of his time in her cabin. He could now move with his natural fluid grace, the limp all but gone. Yet neither he nor his people made any move to leave. The encampment by the creek remained a silent, watchful fixture. The uneasy truce had settled into a strange, unspoken cohabitation. The farm began to change. Under Talion's guidance, Emma learned things her late husband, a man of Ohio soil, had never known. Talion showed her how to read the land, to understand its subtle language. He taught her which wild greens growing by the creek were edible, which roots could be ground into a poultice for a burn, and how the behavior of the lizards sunning themselves on the rocks could predict the weather. In return, she shared her world with him. He was fascinated by her books, though he could not read the words. She would read aloud to him and Samuel in the evenings from the Bible or from John's copy of Leaves of Grass, her voice soft in the lantern light. Talion would listen, his head cocked not for the meaning of the words, but for their music and rhythm. He showed a surprising aptitude for mechanics, watching her fix the water pump, and then, with his own powerful hands, tightening a loose fitting. She hadn't been able to budge, stopping the persistent leak she'd been fighting for months. Their shared grief over their lost loved ones became a quiet cornerstone of their bond. He told her his wife's name was Isley, and that her laugh sounded like the water that ran over the stones in the high mountains. He spoke of their infant son, who had lived only 3 moons before the raid. Emma, in turn, found herself speaking of John for the first time, without the crushing weight of sorrow, telling Talion of his kindness, his unwavering optimism, and his terrible singing voice. They were not replacing their dead. They were honoring them by sharing their memories, finding solace in the discovery that a heart could hold both profound loss and the beginnings of new life. This new life was most evident in Samuel. The boy adored Talion. He followed him everywhere, a small, tow-headed shadow to the tall, dark-haired warrior. Talion, who had lost his own son, poured a gentle affection onto the boy. He taught Samuel how to track a jackrabbit, how to identify birds by their calls, and how to move through the brush without making a sound. He was giving the boy a different kind of education, one of survival and respect for the world around him. Emma watched them, her emotions a tangled knot of gratitude, wonder, and a deep, unsettling fear. She was beginning to feel something for Talion, something that went beyond respect and friendship. It was in the way her breath caught when he would turn and smile at something Samuel said, a rare, brilliant flash of warmth that transformed his severe features. It was in the comfortable silence that now settled between them in the evenings, a silence that felt more companionable than the loneliest years of her marriage. It was a dangerous, impossible feeling, a spark in a tinder-dry land. One blistering afternoon, as Emma was hanging laundry, she saw a plume of dust on the horizon. It wasn't the slow-moving cloud of Mr. Abernathy's wagon. It was faster. Riders. 4 of them. Her blood ran cold. She called for Talion. He emerged from the barn, took one look, and his face became a mask of stone. Inside, he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Both of you. Now." He herded them into the cabin and barred the door. From the Apache camp, a signal, the cry of a hawk, sharp and piercing, cut through the air. The sentries would be alerted. Emma peered through a crack in the shutters. The riders drew closer, reining in their horses just outside her fence line. Her heart sank. She recognized the man in the lead. It was Silas Croft. His face was cruel and shadowed by a filthy hat, a long scar cutting down his left cheek. He was flanked by 3 of the meanest-looking men she had ever seen. The very men Talion had been hunting. Croft spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Well, he drawled his voice, carrying on the wind. "Looks like the little widow Collins is still holding on. Heard in town she keeps to herself. Mighty lonely out here for a pretty thing." His men chuckled a greasy, unpleasant sound. "We're just looking for a little water for our horses, ma'am," another one called out. "And maybe a bite to eat. You wouldn't turn away, weary travellers, would you?" Inside the cabin, Talion stood as still as a predator, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. His eyes were burning with a hatred so intense it was frightening to behold. "Do not answer," he whispered to Emma. Outside, Croft's patience was wearing thin. "No answer. That ain't neighborly. We know you're in there. Maybe you got company. We heard some strange rumors. Folks saying they see smoke out by the creek. Indian smoke." His eyes scanned the property, a greedy, knowing look on his face. He was probing, testing. He likely didn't know for certain that Talion was here, but he suspected something was amiss. Perhaps one of his men had seen the Apache sentries. "Last chance, Mrs. Collins," Croft shouted. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Your choice." Emma looked at Talion. His gaze met hers. In that silent exchange, a decision was made. There would be no more hiding. The bubble had burst. Her farms, this small patch of land that had become a sanctuary, was about to become a battlefield. Talion moved to the back window which overlooked the creek and the Apache camp. He unslung the small bow from his back, not Samuel's toy, but his own powerful weapon. He took a single arrow one with a shaft painted bright red and fired it high into the air. It was not a weapon, but a signal, a call to arms. Croft and his men saw it. A look of confusion, then dawning realization crossed Croft's face. He cursed, long and foul. "It's a trap, the whole damn valley's crawling with them," he roared. "Get to cover." The outlaws scrambled from their horses, taking cover behind the water trough and a low stone wall. The sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the air as one of Croft's men fired at the cabin, the bullet thudding into the log wall just inches from the window. Emma grabbed her shotgun, her hands steady now, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She would not lose another home. She would not lose another family. She moved to the front window, peering through the shutter, the heavy gun resting on the sill. Outside, Silas Croft was laughing a harsh, ugly sound. "You got a devil in there with you, widow. Well, that's fine. We'll just send you both to hell together." From the trees by the creek and the rocks on the ridge, silent figures began to emerge, rifles and bows at the ready. Chief Esker's warriors were closing the net. The truce was over. An alliance forged in blood and mercy was about to be tested by fire. The first shot from the cabin was not from Talion's Winchester, but from Emma's shotgun. One of Croft's men, a lanky outlaw named Jeb, made the mistake of thinking the farmhouse was defended by a lone woman. He broke from cover, making a dash for the barn, intending to set it ablaze and smoke them out. Emma tracked his movement, took a deep breath, as John had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The buckshot tore through the air, catching Jeb in the leg and shoulder. He screamed a high, thin sound of shock and pain and tumbled into the dust, writhing and cursing. "Damn you, woman!" Silas Croft bellowed from behind the water trough. He fired his own pistol at the window, the shot splintering the wooden shutter near Emma's head. She ducked back her ears, ringing the smell of gunpowder, sharp in her nostrils. "Stay away from the window." Talion ordered, his voice calm amidst the chaos. He had taken up a position at the side window, using the narrow opening to his advantage. He wasn't firing wildly. He was waiting his patience, that of a hunter. They will not expect you to fight back so hard. It will make them reckless. He was right. The other two outlaws, enraged at seeing Jeb go down, began laying down a volley of fire at the house, their bullets thudding into the thick log walls. It was a foolish waste of ammunition. While they were distracted, a silent arrow arced from the cottonwoods by the creek and buried itself in the throat of the man firing from behind the stone wall. He made a choking, gurgling sound and fell forward without another cry. "Two down." Croft roared in fury. He was pinned, the farmhouse in front of him, and an unseen enemy closing in from the sides and rear. His greedy raid had turned into a deadly pincer movement. "Silas, we got to get out of here. The last remaining outlaw, a burly man named Gus, yelled, his voice ragged with panic. "Shut up and keep firing." Croft snarled, but he knew Gus was right. He had fatally underestimated the situation. He had expected a frightened widow, not a fortified position with Apache allies. Inside, Emma reloaded the shotgun, her movements practiced and sure. The initial terror had been burned away, replaced by an icy focus. She glanced at Samuel, who was huddled under the heavy oak table, his hands over his ears. She had told him it was a game like thunder and lightning, and that he had to stay in his cave until she said so. His wide, frightened eyes met hers, and she gave him a reassuring nod she did not feel. This was for him, all of it. Talion finally saw his opening. Gus, the burly outlaw, shifted his position to get a better angle on the tree line, exposing his side for a fraction of a second. Talion's Winchester cracked once. Gus jerked, as if struck by lightning, and slumped to the ground, his rifle clattering on the rocks. 3 down. Now it was just Silas Croft. He was alone, his men dead or dying around him. The shooting from the surrounding hills stopped. Emma could feel the collective breath of the Apache warriors waiting. This was no longer their fight. This was personal. Talion Croft's voice was a desperate rasp. "I know you're in there. The one that got away. Come on out and face me, you coward. Or are you going to keep hiding behind that woman's skirts?" Talion looked at Emma. His dark eyes were burning with a cold fire. This was the man who had murdered his wife and child. This was the culmination of his long hunt. "Stay here. Bar the door behind me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "No," Emma said, her voice firm. "You can't. He'll kill you. Your wound is still fresh." "This is my fight, Emma. My honor demands it." "Then my love demands I don't let you go alone." She blurted out the word love tumbling from her lips before she could stop it. The truth of it hung in the air between them, stark and undeniable, in the face of death. Talion froze his eyes, widening slightly. He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smudge of grime. "When this is over," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we will speak of this." He turned before she could protest further and unbarred the back door, slipping out into the blinding sunlight like a phantom. Emma rushed to the front window, her shotgun held tight, ready to defy his wishes and provide cover if she had to. She saw Talion, circling around the barn, using it as cover his knife, now in one hand, his rifle in the other. He was moving toward Croft's position. Croft, meanwhile, was getting desperate. He knew he was surrounded. He made a sudden mad dash for his horse, hoping to break through the Apache line. But Talion was faster. He burst from behind the corner of the barn, cutting off Croft's path. The two men stood 20 yards apart, the dead and dying strewn between them. The outlaw and the warrior finally decided to come out and play. Croft sneered, raising his pistol. Talion didn't answer. He simply dropped his rifle into the dust. Then he dropped his knife. He stood empty-handed, his message clear. This would not be settled with guns. This would be settled by hand, a trial by combat for the souls of those they had lost. Croft stared first in disbelief, then with a cruel, confident grin. He was a bigger man than Talion, broader in the shoulder and heavier in the gut. He thought he had the advantage. He holstered his pistol and drew a large, wicked-looking Bowie knife. "Your mistake," Croft grunted and charged. From the window, Emma watched in horror, her knuckles white on the stock of her gun. She could end it now with one shot, but she knew she couldn't. This was Talion's to finish. It was his right, his vengeance. She could only bear witness. The fight was brutal and swift. Croft came at Talion with a wild, powerful swing of his bowie knife, expecting to overwhelm him with brute force. Talion moved with a grace that was almost liquid, sidestepping the clumsy attack. He flowed around Croft, not meeting force with force, but redirecting it. As the outlaw stumbled past, off balance, Talion drove the heel of his hand into the man's kidney. Croft grunted in pain and surprise, spinning around his face, red with fury. He slashed again, a wide, sweeping arc meant to disembowel. Talion ducked under the blade, his own hand darting out like a striking snake to grip Croft's knife wrist. With a sharp twist, there was an audible crack of bone. Croft screamed as the bowie knife fell from his suddenly useless hand. This was not a brawl, it was an execution. Talion was a warrior, trained in a lethal ballet of combat. Croft was a bully and a murderer, reliant on his gun and the fear he inspired. Without his weapons, he was nothing. Talion drove a fist into Croft's scarred face, snapping his head back. He followed with a disabling blow to the man's knee, buckling his leg. Croft fell heavily to his knees, in the dust, disarmed and broken. He looked up at Talion, his eyes wide with terror. The arrogant sneer finally gone, replaced by a pathetic plea for mercy. "Please!" he whimpered. Talion stood over him, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cold fury. He looked at the sniveling man who had destroyed his family, who had caused so much pain and death. From the hills, the Apache warriors watched in silence. From the cabin window, Emma watched, her heart in her throat. For a long moment, Talion did nothing. He simply looked down at his vanquished foe. Then he leaned in close and spoke in his own language the words, soft but laced with venom. He was telling Croft the names of his wife and child, ensuring the murderer knew exactly whose lives he was paying for. Then Talion turned his back and walked away. A collective gasp seemed to rise from the onlookers, Emma included. He was sparing him. After everything, Croft, seeing Talion walk away, thought he was being granted a reprieve. A sliver of his old arrogance returned. With his good hand, he scrabbled in his boot and pulled out a small hidden derringer. "Apache filth!" he shrieked, raising the tiny pistol. He never fired. From the ridgeline, a single rifle shot echoed through the valley. A puff of dust erupted from the center of Croft's chest. His eyes went wide with a final ultimate surprise, and he toppled backward into the dirt, dead before he hit the ground. Emma looked toward the ridge. Standing there, a smoking rifle in his hand, was Chief Esker. He had watched the entire confrontation. He had honored his son's desire for hand-to-hand combat, but he would not allow his son to be shot in the back by a treacherous snake. The battle was over. A profound silence descended upon the farm, broken only by the groans of the wounded outlaw Jeb and the soft whisper of the wind. Talion walked back to the cabin, his movements weary. He opened the door and his eyes found Emma's. The fire of vengeance was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. He walked to the table where Samuel was still hiding. "It is over, little hawk," he said softly, using his pet name for the boy. "You can come out." Samuel crept out from under the table and without hesitation ran to Talion, wrapping his small arms around the warrior's legs. Talion rested a hand on the boy's head, his fingers trembling slightly. Emma crossed the room and stood before him. There were no words. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her touch conveying everything she could not say. He covered her hand with his own. The cabin door opened again. Chief Esker stood in the doorway, his imposing figure filling the frame. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the scene, his son, the white woman, the small boy clinging to his warrior son's leg. His eyes, which had been so hard and suspicious now, held a new light. He looked at the clean cabin, the neatly stitched bandage on Talion's side, and the shotgun resting by the window where Emma had fought alongside them. He spoke, and this time Talion translated his voice low. "My father says you have the heart of a Chiricahua woman. He says you fought for your home and for my life, not as a white woman, but as a warrior." Eska then stepped forward and placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. He spoke again. "He says this boy has the son of a chief as his brother. He will always have a place among our people." Finally, the chief looked directly at Emma, his gaze deep and searching. "He says this land, Talion," translated his voice thick with emotion as he looked around the small cabin, "is your land. But you are no longer alone on it. You are Ndenti, friend of the people. Our protection is yours. Our fight is your fight." Eska gave a curt, respectful nod, and then he was gone. Outside, his warriors were already at work, gathering their dead and wounded, dealing with the outlaw bodies, erasing the signs of the battle, as if it had never happened. In the quiet aftermath, standing in the center of her small cabin, Emma Collins looked at Talion, her hand still in his. The world outside was still a dangerous, prejudiced place. Their future was a path with no map, but for the first time since John's death, she was not alone. She had faced down death and found not an end, but a new, terrifying and beautiful beginning. Her home was no longer a monument to a dead man's dream. It was the foundation of a new one, a bridge between two worlds, built on the unlikely cornerstones of mercy, grief, and love. The story of Emma Collins and Talion is not one that ends with a simple ride into the sunset. It is a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of landscapes, amidst the deepest prejudices, the human heart seeks connection. Theirs was a life lived on the frontier between two cultures, a constant negotiation of love and loyalty in a world that understood neither. They faced judgment from the town of Providence and the suspicions of their own people, building a family on the foundation of shared respect and fierce devotion. Their love story wasn't written in storybooks. It was carved into the very dust of the Arizona Territory, a quiet, powerful legacy of courage. A reminder that sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't of land or gold, but of the humanity in one another. If their journey from strangers to saviors to soulmates moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it. Share this story with someone who appreciates tales of the Old West with a real heart, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true-to-life historical storytelling. Click the notification bell so you won't miss our next adventure into the past. Thank you for listening.